Welcome to The Hastening. The Hastening is a show about U.S. imperialism, and in particular, it's a way to explain some ideas about how imperialism has evolved into something that I call Crypto-Imperialism. I think the best way to explain this is probably to go in phases. Phase 1, old-fashioned imperialism. The military of some country shows up in some other country, knocks out the local government, and suppresses the local population. They control the government of that country through a governor or some appointed administrator, and that government gets as much stuff, like raw materials and labor, out of that country as they can. That system, while wildly profitable, there's no cost when you're stealing, it's pure profit, is pretty hard to defend. Because it turns out people don't like it when you do this to them. And if you do this to the entire society that you colonize, the backlash also comes from the entire society. Landowners, merchants, fishermen, peasants, wage earners. If everyone is under the boot, then once there's this collective realization that we're not going to stand for this anymore, everybody that's not paid off by the empire tends to get in on that dog pile before it's all said and done. So one by one, colonies that were run in this fashion have died off, starting with the Spanish and the Dutch, and then the British and the French, and finally the Portuguese Empire, which collapsed in the 70s and more or less ended that era of empire. In nearly every place where old-school imperialism collapsed, neo-imperialism sprung up to replace it. There's a few reasons for this. One is that no empire has ever let go of the ongoing thieving operations they had in a newly independent country unless they were removed by force. Meaning, if you're Niger and you've got lots of uranium, and the French colonize you and steal your uranium, changing the government from a French administrator to a Nigerian government doesn't necessarily solve your problem if your new government just lets the French keep those uranium mines. But in a lot of cases, having been a colony means that you don't really have local industry. You have the empire's businesses, and beyond that, you've mostly just got subsistence farming. It's the local landowners and small businesses that tend to be at the core of some of these nationalist decolonization movements, as their positions of power in that society and economy are the ones most held back by imperialism, as strange as that might sound on first pass. Peasant farmers, for instance, may not see that much of a difference between foreign landlords and domestic ones depending on how brutal each of them chooses to be. But the people who would be the movers and shakers, the economic and political elite of a society, feel very aggrieved at being denied that place by foreign occupiers, and history shows us that these groups tend to lead nationalist movements against empire. The US's separation from Britain was on exactly these lines. Working class people signed up and fought too, but the leadership on the military and political side were the economic elite of the colonies, the owners of a lot of land and slaves who knew how much better off they would be personally with the country under their control, rather than having to haggle with the British aristocracy and monarchy. But in the case of the US, that new ruling class was itself part of the colonial ruling class first, so they had a large head start on solidifying their power. If you don't have a class like that to take the reins, and you don't have enough industry to have a developed working class, there's a power vacuum when the empire leaves. And this is exactly why we end up with neo-imperialism. The most common outcome when a colony liberates itself from an empire is that the new government develops using the people who would be the ruling class of the former colony as collaborators, allowing the colonizer to continue to control the things that they really want, the raw materials and resources, from afar. And this diffuses that contradiction from earlier, because now instead of having the whole colony being aligned against the colonizer, part of the colony are deputized as the enforcers of the empire, and the society is divided. And this is why we call it neo-imperialism. It's the same outcome as imperialism, the extraction of all those sweet resources, but with the veneer of home rule, using proxies who are masters at manipulating existing conflicts within a neo-colony to keep people divided instead of uniting against the empire and its puppets. So then what is crypto-imperialism? Well, let's approach it this way. How do imperialism and neo-imperialism differ in the education system in the empire? When you have an imperialist system, education about the colonies and the empire is right at the core of higher education. You need to teach your students, especially the ones at a high enough level that they're likely to be in your government and bureaucracy, what your colonies are, where they are, who the people there are, and how they can be divided and conquered, and what valuable resources those colonies have, the flora, the fauna, the terrain. And not just like a few of them either. An empire needs a lot of people to administer any colony, but especially multiple colonies bigger than your homeland. When they said the sun never set on the British Empire, at its height, that meant installing capable British administrators from Belize to Hong Kong, including India, which alone was many times larger than Britain by size and population. Or Portugal in the 1960s, who was trying to hang on to Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde, thousands of miles away and much larger than them. There was a desperate need for participation in the empire. So why wouldn't you teach your people about your colonies in an era where you openly celebrate empire and advocate for it? But what does a neo-imperialist empire teach its students about its empire? Or put differently, how does a society teach itself about a thing it doesn't even acknowledge exists? You can't in any transparent way. When Egypt was a British colony, the British Empire trained specific groups within the military and intelligence for deployment in Egypt, so that they would be as effective as possible at keeping Egypt a colony. Egypt is now an American colony under the neo-imperial model, receiving $1.3 billion every year in US military aid to be a good friend to Israel and to keep the Suez Canal open. But the US, unlike the British Empire, does not admit that Egypt is a colony, which means we don't prepare ourselves generation after generation and administration after administration to govern Egypt. Some people develop a passion for studying Egypt's people and history, and that's who we have to select from for the State Department and military and intelligence roles dealing with the Egyptians. And plenty of them will, if not guided in their education by imperialists, whose whole goal is to keep the empire going, come to the conclusion that it actually sucks that Egypt is a US colony. Meaning a good chunk of who we end up educating on a certain subject aren't even ideologically fit for the roles that the imperial government needs them for. I kind of feel this one on a personal level. I have an education in politics in a country that does all its politics via corruption and graft, meaning the only immediate value of my political education is being able to recognize that our political system is all corruption. And the Americans I know and listen to who have a deep knowledge of Egypt wouldn't last 5 minutes at the State Department. But Bob Menendez didn't get immediately thrown out of the Senate for using his Senate Foreign Affairs Committee chairmanship to pull favors for Egyptian business elites. And that's the backwardsness of crypto-imperialism on full display. The people with the real knowledge are inconvenient, so the only hireable people for a crypto empire are those whose limited knowledge and experience on the subject comes entirely through their own personal corruption. And Egypt is almost a bad example here because there are probably a decent number of people who choose to study Egypt because of its size and historical significance relative to smaller and newer countries. How many people does the government really have to pick from as diplomats and spies and analysts to cover Bolivia or Guinea-Bissau or Timor-Leste? Next to nobody that has anything that they'd actually want to hear. In a lot of cases, like with Cuba, that main group is exiles. And even though they might be enthusiastic about the US empire's policies towards their homeland, these kinds of groups are usually too hot-headed and ill-disciplined to depend on much for, which puts the fate of the empire into the hands of two groups. People in intelligence, like spies, who can keep alive secretly the plan for US colonies and decide who needs to know what to move those plans forward, and elected or appointed people in government, most of whom are so breathtakingly ignorant that you wonder if they can even find their own house district on the map, let alone have even a remotely functional understanding of the civil war in Sudan or the Rwandan-backed invasion of the Congo. Which is why I call it crypto-imperialism. The knowledge of the true state of the empire becomes contained entirely within institutions like the CIA, the unelected foreign policy bureaucrats who can provide some degree of continuity which electoral politics lacks. They're trying desperately to steer the ship, but it's difficult to do that when you have deliberately misled the whole population to such a degree that even the elected officials that you depend on are too misled or underinformed to explain the empire's real interests to. It's hard to put an exact timestamp on when exactly crypto-imperialism began because it's not one singular change in system. It's a drift in mindset and consciousness that happens over decades because of a change in education and media. The US had a head start on neo-imperialism though, beginning the practice of using local puppets rather than outright occupation as early as the 1880s and 90s, extensively in Latin America. So even by the time Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were expanding the US's control in Latin America, there were probably already some people buying into the lies around US intervention there. But I think it's really the end of the Cold War that turned creeping crypto-imperialism into such strong societal brain rot that it is now contributing to the increasingly fast collapse of the US empire. During the Cold War, our media developed the tactic of keeping the communist and non-aligned world on the defensive as much as possible, and coddling the US's allies, often by just keeping them off the TV rather than even trying to give them a positive spin. If you grew up in that era, you probably heard a lot about the USSR on the news, and the People's Republic of China, and Cuba, and Vietnam. You probably heard about every nasty thing any one of the governments of those countries ever did, plus a whole bunch of things they didn't do just for good measure. But you probably heard a lot less about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Thailand, or Indonesia, or Colombia, or Argentina, or Guatemala. This way of looking at the world, scaremongering about those not on our side and hiding our crimes and those of our allies, is now so deeply a part of the American media and mindset that you might not have ever noticed it until I just said it. And if your reaction is to say,
"Oh, well, that's because those are the bad guys and us and our friends are the good guys,"
do you hear yourself? In the post-USSR world, that list of enemies got a lot smaller overnight, and it weakened the power of a lot of those still on the board. And I think that decades of creep combined with this big reset of our mentality to being post-Cold War caused a massive shift towards mental isolation. The media got even more inward-looking, and in tandem with the neoliberal gutting of the economy, Americans started getting more and more suspicious of foreign aid. And it's exactly that issue of empire being perceived as charity that I think evolved into crypto-imperialism. There's two big subgroups within crypto-imperialism, and you can really see the archetypes by looking at the current administration and comparing it to the last one. Joe Biden and the liberal side of crypto-imperialism are all about promoting the idea of the US being a civilizing force in the world. A pretty much direct continuation of what was called the white man's burden, the racist imperialist lie to justify empire during the 19th century. The US's actions are always presented as being in defense of human rights and international law to a shocking and almost laughable degree. People like Biden, Obama, and Hillary Clinton will do a coup against the democratically elected leader, arm a mass-murdering drug cartel affiliate as the replacement, arrest that man for drug trafficking, and then when the wife of the dude you cooed gets elected later, still have the audacity to try to conspire against her too. And if that sounds oddly specific, that's exactly what Honduras has been going through since 2009 in the CIA-backed coup of Manuel Zelaya. The whole liberal strategy is to say that they do good things abroad and hope that you never investigate whether or not that's true. At this point, the Democrats' foreign policy is more or less identical to the Bush administration. W, to be specific. They use the language of compassion and human rights, but their actions make what they say count for little and less. Throughout the Israeli carpet bombing of Gaza over the nearly last 2 years, the Biden State Department press crew, people like Matt Miller, delivered some of the most sociopathic statements I've ever heard as they tried to wash their hands of crimes that they were actively participating in.
On a scale of 1 to 10, or on any scale that you would like, how have they complied or not complied with the requests or demands, frankly, that were in the letter?
Let me do it on a pass-fail instead of trying to give a grade, and that on a pass-fail basis.
Well, that is a grade.
They have, I mean, a letter grade, a percentage grade, a pass-fail. And that as of today, the situation has not significantly turned around. We have seen an increase in some measurements. We've seen an increase in the number of crossings that are open, but just if you look at the stipulated recommendations in the letter, those have not been met at this point.
So that's a fail.
We're not at the end of the period yet. They have not. If you look at the what we ultimately judge, what we ultimately judge on, which is the results on the ground, the results are not good enough today.
Right.
No.
So that's a fail.
They certainly they certainly do not have a passing grade. They have failed. I said they have failed to implement all of the things that we recommend in that letter. Now that said, we are not at the end of the 30-day period, and we are in conversation.
Not ready to give them
It's not the end. It's not the end of the semester. We don't hand out grades in the middle.
I suspect that the levity is a little bit inappropriate.
No,
but look, you guys say they haven't done enough, so it's a fail at this point.
We are not at the end of where we are able to make an assessment. But I can tell you, the situation has not been good enough for some time, and the situation has not improved sufficiently in the 21, 22 days, whatever it is, since we sent that letter.
Okay.
There is still a week or so to go until we reach the end of the period, but there is much more that we need to see them do.
But they're all out of government now and spending more time with their focus groups. So who are these conservative crypto-imperialists and what's their deal? Trump takes the lie at the heart of Biden and Obama's imperialism, that it's all charity and we're nice guys, and he flips it around. We're not nice, and we're not giving out any handouts. The problem is that most of imperialism is not even remotely charity, and even the part that is kind of charity has a function for the empire. Things like food and medical donations are good ways to infiltrate a society, to create demand for exports from the colonizer, and to smuggle drugs, guns, and money in or out of the country, on top of just making for a good photo op every once in a while. And the CIA and other agencies within the US government have a long history of infiltration through aid agencies. All of this is pretty topical, as one of the first things the Trump regime did after taking office was send Elon Musk and his so-called Department of Government Efficiency after USAID, the State Department's program for providing military and economic support to allied regimes and sometimes to civilians. For somebody to come in and start ripping out a program like this to save a few bucks is the smoke billowing from our crypto-imperialist fire. Doge and them don't understand whatever the CIA was doing in Sudan via the Food Aid Initiative. They just saw something that looked to them like a handout to brown people that aren't Americans, and that was all they needed to know. MAGA imperialism is basically just the contradictions of crypto-imperialism breaking down until they separate like oil and vinegar. They reject a lot of the core ideas of neo-imperialism, but the thing in particular that I think they resent about neo-imperialism is the idea that they should have to deal with the local ruling classes of the colonies. Remember, the thing that defines neo-imperialism is the transfer of rule from an implanted colonial governor to local rulers affiliated with the colonizer. It's stronger because it does such a much better job of hiding the empire's continued role in their economy, but it does come with some compromise. If you make enemies of the local elites, who we sometimes call compradors, you end up right back at nationalist, separatist revolution. But think about how ornery and petty people like Trump and Musk view these relationships.
Some guy who I send money and food and weapons wants me to listen to him?
They struggle to see any of these kinds of distributions of payments or aid as anything but quid pro quo, and then they're mad when they don't get absolute obeisance in return. Their mindset is shifting more towards something like old school imperialism, but in an apparently unconscious and chaotic way. You can even see this pivot back to open might makes right in the US aid cuts. Because only 2 items survived the US aid purge. The US military aid to Israel and US military aid to Egypt for over $3 billion and $1.3 billion every year. By far the 2 biggest line items in the US aid budget. By doing this, they are saying loudly and clearly that they don't have any interest in any kind of program that puts food on tables in Egypt, or keeps the power on, or modernizes or expands the Suez Canal, or does anything to pacify Egypt in a non-violent way. Remember what we said in the beginning about phases of imperialism? Which one does that sound like to you? The one where everyone except the small group of imperial enforcers is thrown under the bus, uniting almost the entire population against the empire? That one? We were already failing to support a lot of our client states effectively before Trump, and since the Cold War ended, we have been trending towards a mostly military aid-focused approach. And the results are not great from an imperial perspective, as the US sphere gets more and more disjointed and fractured. The Trump regime's aggressive approach on telling allies to pay their fair share is going to push a lot of already skeptical allies right out of our sphere entirely. All because they have this completely misplaced view that the aid received by US allies is them taking advantage of us and not our means of controlling and taking advantage of them. And all of this only happens in a crypto-imperialist mindset. Right-wing media whipped up the Obama is giving to in Mad Lib formula for their news, riled people up for years about ending any kind of those programs, and then Elon Musk and a bunch of terminally online 20-somethings got a hold of those programs, and without understanding that there could even be subtext or ulterior motives there, just started ripping out the fundamental piping of the US empire. And this is to be expected. Within a neo-empire, the political parties become less and less aware of the imperial machinery, except for the handful of people who get pulled in by the spies to help operate it. Why would a political operative or a media mouthpiece hold back from using some aid program as ammo against an opponent when they don't understand the nature of the relationship or even the existence of the empire? Take that situation in Sudan with the food aid. The US government hasn't ever really had a reliable partner in Sudan. Omar al-Bashir, the general and former dictator of the country, was under US sanctions for a long time, and his 2019 coup opened up a huge opportunity for the US to get someone they like in power in the capital, Khartoum. And keep in mind, Sudan is a big country and very important to the region, so there's been a lot of hands in that cookie jar since 2019, especially the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Emiratis. The ongoing civil war there is between these factions, with the Egyptians and Saudis sponsoring General Burhan and the army, while the UAE backs General Hamedi and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, who are the primary perpetrators of the first Darfur genocide, as well as another ongoing genocide in Darfur. Burhan and the army are no angels by any means, but the Rapid Support Forces are some of the most reprehensible ghouls on the face of this planet, as are their sponsors in Dubai. I don't want to get too lost on this right now because I have a whole script in the works for Sudan on this show, but suffice it to say, I believe that this war is a sock puppet fight between the Gulf states. Specifically, I think the UAE convinced the RSF that they could overthrow Burhan and the army and take control of the country. That outcome is great for the Gulf states either way. If the RSF lose, then Burhan and the military get to exploit a state of crisis to solidify their new dictatorship. Since that 2019 coup, there have been repeated failed talks to transfer power to civilian rule and democracy, the last of which collapsed right before the war started. And if the RSF were to win, they would be backed by the UAE, who would probably put in a good word for them as far as getting recognized. The war has set the prospects of democracy and civilian rule back a long way, meaning we need to be suspicious of why this war started, especially coming so soon off the back of more failed transition talks. Plus, in spite of having no gold domestically, the UAE is one of the world's largest exporters of gold, because they buy stolen gold from Sudan through the RSF, and war is a great excuse for them to pilfer out more gold. PSA, don't buy gold, or diamonds. Just don't do it. Every person involved in their production is basically enslaved, and the people who make all the money are mass murderers. Point being, there's a lot of things pointing to this war being born out of foreign meddling, and in case you didn't already know, Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia are all US puppets and allies, which means ultimately this plan of throwing Sudan into civil war to subvert democracy is rooted in Washington. Because even if I'm wrong about the level of pre-planning on the part of the UAE in particular, and the war actually does stem purely from disputes between the army and the RSF, and the foreign meddlers all just picked their horses accordingly, the US is still refusing to knock the heads together of the Arab leaders to force their proxies into a truce. If the US didn't want a war, it would be doing something to end that war, and there might not have been a war in the first place. The Biden administration wanted us to believe that they were negotiating a truce, but that is a really frankly pathetic pretext. The RSF leaders are undisputed war criminals, and there is no legitimate outcome where they have even partial governance, especially since the territory that they would most likely control in a split would be Darfur. The only path forward is for the army to win, to disband the RSF, and then for the army regime to be disbanded and submit to civilian rule and democracy. The US has been taking a position of neutrality, not because there's any practical or moral reason to based on the conditions in Sudan, but because they don't want to upset their puppets, the Emiratis in particular, during their human cockfighting game. If the US was really serious about ending that war, they would start by putting diplomatic, economic, and military pressure on the Emirati terror state. Until the US condemns Emirati support for the RSF, every other action towards Sudan is just a smokescreen. And while all of this drags on, as the US lets its allies dig their claws in deeper, ensuring the new Sudanese government is made in the image of its abhorrent neighbors, the food aid was meant as a pacification tool. Millions of people have been displaced by the fighting, and parts of the country are already experiencing famine. The movements for democracy and against military rule aren't free to demonstrate due to the war, and their forces are likely scattered around the country and in neighboring countries like Chad, where hundreds of thousands of Sudanese have fled since the war began. So while those forces might be weak as a result of this scattering, they might also be stronger if they've organized in secret among the displaced, and especially if they've managed to accumulate and stockpile weapons under the fog of war. We don't know for sure, because whether they're building in secret or scattered to the wind, we'll only find out once the war gets drawn to a conclusion and the masses either rise to fight the victor or get suppressed. But what does the canceling of food aid have to do with the pro-democracy forces? You ever heard that Bob Marley song that goes, "Them belly full but we hungry, a hungry mob is an angry mob"? Those folks that are trying to prepare the masses in Sudan to snatch power away from whoever wins this civil war are going to be a lot more successful in their efforts when the flow of food aid into the country dwindles. Starving people have no choice but to fight their way out of starvation, and the last thing the army and the RSF want to contend with is a radicalized, hungry, and potentially armed population. And frankly, the political damage done by a famine can still swing back around later even after food is returned. Like if the army wins and dismantles the RSF, the severity of famine faced during the war will be a factor in how hard people fight to remove Burhan and the generals once the RSF is gone, and vice versa. And that's what I mean about the food aid being primarily a pacifier from the standpoint of the US government under Biden. We have to reject outright the idea that it could be benevolent. If the US cared about the people of Sudan, then they would make the Emirati terror state pay for backing the RSF who started this war. It's economic and strategic interests governing the US's choices here. That much is beyond dispute. Food aid to Sudan bought food from US farmers, removing excess stock from the US market to keep prices up, while feeding millions of displaced people to hold them over until the war ends and things go back to normal. Economic and strategic goals achieved. Which takes us back to MAGA crypto-imperialism being like oil and vinegar. They have brainwashed themselves into having an absolute aversion to anything foreign and anything that could be construed as charity, in a way that makes it really easy to see this drift in mindset that led to crypto-imperialism and is now leading to its breakdown. Take Reagan. The Reagan administration was mostly neo-imperialist, but the kind of rhetoric they used is the foundation for crypto-imperialism, so they're kind of the bridge. You would have been pretty hard-pressed to convince James Baker or Alexander Haig that cutting off food aid to Sudan was a clever move. I think they probably would have seen it the way Biden and Blinken saw it. But the anti-welfare, anti-aid propaganda that the Reagan regime pushed out is what created the mindset of Doge. Reagan and his crew's ideas were controversial and new at their time, but they are basically dogma in our political culture now, especially on the right. Meaning Reagan and them could much more easily hold the line between what was convenient and effective to say and what was convenient and effective to do, and their successors have let that line blur and fade. And part of that is that they are so insular and averse to anything foreign that they can't even process who are their friends and who are their foes. An empire can kind of look like a welfare state if that's what you condition your brain to look for. So all those allies and proxies can start to look like welfare queens through a certain pair of eyes. Imperialism has to be rooted in a certain worldliness. Even the most racist British person during the imperial era, I'm talking about queasy at the sight of anyone so dark as an Italian-level racist, wanted to go to India to take their spices and their tea. The debate over tariffs since the election has highlighted to me the degree to which a lot of Americans have no clue where stuff comes from. I've had people tell me their solution to tariffs on Mexico was that they were going to buy American coffee. Even the most fractionally literate 19th century British chimney sweep knew that tea came from the Far East. And sometimes people still even say Ceylon when talking about certain types of black tea, which was the British name for Sri Lanka under imperial rule. And yet we have plenty of educated Americans who earn high salaries that if you ask them where coffee and avocado is from, will say, "The store." This is the result of the low information environment in our media and the lack of any direction in the government. It's easier for them to manage us in this state of stunted intellectual development, and it seems like we're stuck here until either we can wake up or they realize they can't run an empire if we're on average this incapable of grappling with basic facts about reality. If this feels like a random tangent for me to call them dumb, it is worth remembering that time that Herman Cain said he didn't care who was the president of Uzbekistan. That's one of those moments I'll never forget hearing for the first time, because he gets the name of the country right, realizes he was about to defeat his own point by even knowing the name of this country, and then mangles it on purpose because knowing the name of a country in Central Asia would be cringe and liberal. He knew his base would laugh and think it was very funny that he dunked on the Uzbekistani like that, and that he was a true America First patriot specifically for not knowing something about a foreign country. An entire political movement within an empire that thinks and acts like this cannot sustain the empire long term. Either you want to roll Uzbekistan up into your geopolitical bloc, have them as a proxy and an arms customer, raid their natural resources on the cheap, and exploit their workers, which will require you knowing the name of the country, who its leaders are, and occasionally checking in on those leaders and making sure they don't need your help to fend off forces that will take away all your access to Uzbekistan. Or you can clown on the Uzbekis, tell their leaders to their face that you think anyone who learns their names is a cup, and plan on not asking them for any favors. MAGA Doge crypto-imperialism is the almost childlike belief that you can have the power of friendship in exchange for nothing but disrespect and malice, and that not just anyone, but everyone will go for it. But I don't want to overemphasize the element of ignorance in MAGA imperialism, though it is obviously prominent. Because when they are cooking, it is strictly Michelin star. Like with this whole thing with Russia and Ukraine. The Russian-Ukrainian war is the exact opposite of the Sudanese civil war in this regard. In Sudan, the GOP has let their delusions and misunderstandings get in the way of advancing the interests of the empire, while the Democrats were, as far as I could tell, playing that game pretty well, if the goal was to prevent an election or a revolution in Sudan and to extract as much gold from Sudan as possible. But in Ukraine, it's the Democrats who got too high on their own supply about democracy and sovereignty and lost sight of the bigger picture as far as empire is concerned. The Trump crew, on the other hand, are exhibiting some cold, calculated, realpolitik. They took a good hard look at the chessboard and figured that trying to fight Russia and China simultaneously was likely to be disastrous, and that putting a wedge in the BRICS alliance before things developed too much further was the way to go. BRICS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, a block of the strongest so-called developing countries that formed 20 or so years ago and has been growing in size and economic and political power over that time. That bloc combined now has a higher GDP than the US and its core bloc of allies. So they're getting stronger and stand to become a new center of economic and political gravity in the world. This represents the US empire's largest threat if it were to solidify into a more formalized political alliance, especially if they agreed to borderless trade or a single currency that could replace the US dollar as the global standard. But right now, the BRICS is still pretty informal, basically just a summit club like the G7. So you can bet that with the CIA and US intelligence trying to cleave that group apart just makes sense, and Russia is an obvious target for conservative elements of the intelligence community especially. There's a variety of reasons that this makes sense for a white supremacist settler empire like the US. The big one is that China is simply way more powerful than Russia economically. Russia is still quite strong militarily, but that would matter less if the US had Russia as an ally. In fact, Russia would be even further cemented as an arms dealer and a gas station if it were within the US sphere, because all the incentive to produce anything else domestically would be crushed under even remotely free trade within that sphere. China's industrial capacity, though, is greater than the US's now, and Chinese GDP will surpass US GDP sometime this decade. The US could not make China its junior partner without destroying China's industrial base in a war, and there is zero chance of a US-China alliance for this reason. One will dominate the other, and the one that will eventually be dominated is unlikely to just let that happen without a fight. Race is a factor too, both because the Russians are white and the Chinese aren't, and because the Russians are much more prone to the paternalistic European way of dealing with the rest of the world than the Chinese are. China's Belt and Road Initiative has expanded local infrastructure in Asia, Africa, and Latin America far more than any US or European economic development program ever has. Chinese aid tends to be far less restrictive in how it can be used by recipient countries, allowing them to develop areas of the economy that they see as most beneficial to the country. The US empire's biggest economic relief and emergency lending programs come through the World Bank and the IMF. These loans are heavily restricted, aimed at imposing severe austerity on the recipient and weakening the domestic economy to make it ripe for exploitation by foreign businesses. The Chinese are still benefiting from their lending and aid programs too, because when the government of Zambia borrows from the Chinese government, it often turns around and buys Chinese goods and services with some of those funds. And when they have developed Zambian infrastructure, one of the beneficiaries is Chinese importers looking to buy Zambian labor and raw materials that are now much more accessible. It's not charity on China's part, but it's at least pretty symbiotic. The IMF World Bank model is predatory no matter how you twist it. They have no interest in economic development. The goal is to make domestic labor dependent on foreign capital and create an easy market to dump exports in. All of this is abhorrent from a US perspective because the last thing you want is someone trying to develop a symbiotic relationship with the people you're trying to keep in serfdom. But this mafia-era Russian government has the same playbook as us. They're not very interested in development. They send weapons and they try to control things as best they can, or at very least, promote an enemy of my enemy outcome when given the option, even if they can't exert control. The US could compete with Russia on this indefinitely in a way that's profitable for both. But the US cannot compete with China's global development model. One by one, the US's proxies would fall into the Chinese sphere, and the US empire would unwind and collapse. Trying to cleave Russia off from the BRICS and make them a US ally is such a clever and sophisticated imperial maneuver that it's hard to imagine it comes from such a mind-bogglingly ignorant and goofy group of people as the Trump White House. And I think it's only possible because they have enough of those neo-imperialist voices in the room to shape the direction of policy. Marco Rubio in particular seems like one of those voices, and ironically enough, I think that's why every Democrat voted for him in his Senate confirmation, as much as they may be ruining that now after what happened to Zelensky at the White House. And this is where I should make an important point. I want you to dissociate yourself a bit from the feelings you might have about some of these conflicts, wars, and foreign policy issues, and basically the opposite of the way that our media has conditioned us to dissociate. We're taught to dissociate in the, oh well, that's life kind of way about world events. Like, you know about chocolate, right? So much so that just by asking in this context if you know about chocolate, you probably know I'm talking about the kids who were more or less enslaved to pick cocoa beans in places like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. You've probably heard other people mention it, or seen it on one of the news reports every 18 months or so about how Hershey's or Nestle got caught again using child slaves. Or you've noticed while shopping for chocolate that these days, like half the chocolate is specifically marketed as slave-free, which is what I mean about dissociation. Has anyone ever used this to try to convince you of regime change in Ghana? Do you even know who the president of Cote d'Ivoire is? Does the media ever bring up the issue of government when they report the stories about the child slaves? Or the relationship of our government to those governments? Or were you conditioned by all the media around this issue to never expect anything to change other than maybe you being the one to buy chocolate that claims to be slave-free? So if that's your government and media's response to children being enslaved to enrich American companies, you really have to question why they sometimes suddenly care about a thing, and suddenly sometimes really want you to care too. When I talk about dissociating your feelings, I mean to separate the righteous and genuine feelings you have for the people whose suffering you've seen or heard of from the feelings that the government and the media are trying to elicit from you in order to exploit your sympathy to back a US action that expands or upholds the power of this empire at the expense of the people you empathize with. The actions of our government will never be anything but that, regardless of what they say or how charismatic their chosen leader is or how dire they say the situation is on the ground. The people who make these choices in our government, including the elected officials, but especially those in the CIA and the deep state, don't even have the capacity to feel the empathy you feel for other people. If they were guided by empathy or democracy or human rights or justice, we couldn't explain the vast majority of decisions that they make. But when we look at things in terms of economic and strategic gain, every single thing they do makes sense, even if that's sometimes a bad choice. They ring the alarm bells whenever there's something to gain for the empire and its corporations to be fought for, whether the villain they have to play up is an actual monster or just fighting for their people. And they rock us to sleep about wherever they're already freely pillaging to keep us in the dark. None of the information about what's happening there is likely to reflect well on us, which is exactly how we end up with so many of us having no clue what even happens outside of our borders. Unless someone else did it, allegedly. Each of the stages of empire that we talked about have had their contradictions. The first stage was too direct, and it pushed the natives of a colony into one camp that was impossible to suppress. The neo-imperial model solved that contradiction by creating internal conflict within the colonies. But it fails to reproduce the colonial mindset in the population of the empire in any usable way. The crypto-imperialist stage is likewise doomed by these same kinds of contradictions. You can't have an empire without an imperial mindset, but the world has little tolerance left for outright imperial domination. Even many Americans don't want to see themselves in this light. The number of people who are willing to proclaim loudly to be imperialists is pretty few, and the number of people who tolerate such people is even fewer. Even Joe Biden's folksy old grandpa routine was a touch too harsh. His refusal to rein in the Israelis in Gaza turned what looked like an imminent, groundbreaking Saudi-Israeli mutual recognition and cooperation agreement into a new Saudi-Israeli feud that got the Saudis talking to Iran again. And if Biden's touch was harsh, what does that say for Trump's? Shortly after he posted that heinous video of him and Elon hanging out on a beach in Gaza, Egypt called an emergency Arab League summit in Cairo. It's easy to see why Egypt would take the lead on pushing back. Polls show that 90% or so of Egyptians reject their government having diplomatic ties with Israel and have since the 1979 Camp David Accords. Egypt is the exact kind of country that is the linchpin of the US empire and needs some delicate touch to keep it in line. A military dictator like Abdel Fattah al-Sisi needs some help with the material conditions, especially in the economy. Because it's one thing to win an election with 95% of the vote when unemployment is low. But if a fifth of the country are out of work or something like that, nobody is going to easily fall for the trick that everyone else is somehow loving life and happy with this regime. This is a big part of what happened to Sisi's old boss, Hosni Mubarak. He held on for decades until the ruin of the 2008 financial crisis rippled through his country and fanned the existing flames of discontent until they were raging. And all that time he had the US helping to soften the contradictions and keep the population pacified. A US policy of non-pacification basically forces the reorganization of the entire US bloc. But how that impact will be felt varies within the bloc. Egypt is a tricky one because they're tangled up in a bunch of really hairy stuff. Yeah, sure, if you're al-Sisi and the US is telling you, here's $1.3 billion to spend on weapons, soldier wages, and bribes for officers, good luck. At some level, you might have to start thinking about looking for a different patron who may not give you as much guns or cash, but can actually bolster your economy. But it's not that simple when Egypt is in a negotiated truce with the Israelis, and a change in Egyptian government or policy that breaks too much from the US will freak the Israelis out and could push things to the brink of another war. So let's look instead at a country which is still a large regional player and still key to the US bloc, which has been struggling with the absent-minded parenting of the US crypto empire and may wind up going for the exits over the next 4 years. Nigeria. Things have been kind of tense in West Africa these past few years. A wave of popular coups swept through Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, causing a huge rift in the economic community of West African states, also known as ECOWAS. After that coup in Niger, the Nigerian president Bola Tinubu, who at the time of the coup was the sitting chairman of ECOWAS, threatened to use military force in Niger to remove the coup government. It's pretty clear to me why Tinubu would have felt like saber rattling on this, as the French were especially impacted by the Nigerian coup. They get most of their electricity from nuclear, most of their fissile material from uranium, and most of their uranium from Niger. A new Nigerian government that chose to deny uranium exports to the French, especially after the sanctions on Russia have made their uranium off limits, would be just about one of the worst outcomes for the French, and we've been heading that direction as the government of Niger ramps up expulsions of foreign mining companies. But it wasn't France's problems that Tinubu cared about, it was his own. The last thing one Western puppet wants is to see a bunch of other Western puppets in their neck of the woods get toppled. So far, this has been pretty isolated to formerly French-controlled countries, and formerly British Nigeria wanted to get out ahead of this before it mutated and started affecting Anglophone parts of Africa like Nigeria. He was probably hoping to get the blessing of the French to start a war that they would get involved in later, but they refused and he had to roll over. But all this calculus relies on Tinubu to expect the French and ultimately the US to come to his aid in a variety of ways. At what point does self-interest require your mindset to shift? If you believe in your stronger allies and can depend on them, then you might try to hold out against a rising tide of opposition. Even if it's just because you don't trust negotiating with the other side and feel like your friends are still strong enough and reliable enough to come back you up. But as that faith starts to wear thin and you don't think your friends are strong enough to show up for you, or maybe that they don't even want to, at that point negotiating with the enemy at the gates is a lot better of a plan than holding out. And even if it's not more appealing to the person in charge, it sure is for their lieutenants all the way down to the people, and that's how you get coups and revolutions. And with friends like the US under Trump, who needs enemies? Tinubu, al-Sisi, Abdullah, Bukele, Bularte, the King of Thailand. I could go on and on listing people in this exact same sort of position, being entirely reliant on US protection and security and now entirely unsure of whether or not they really have it. Some of them will cut ties with us and look to Russia for security, though the less the US is a powerful force, the less common this will become. Russia offers little other than being an arms dealer, which is fine short term if you're a country like Burkina Faso and you have very limited arms manufacturing capacity. But the weaker the French and Americans get, the less the West Africans might need to source large arms purchases in the first place. And the Russians aren't getting the chance to replace American and French extraction there, as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are all nationalizing a lot of their natural resources right now. And I think you can see where that trend ends. China will be the new economic center of gravity, whether anybody likes that or not, because they've done the work of continuing to develop their productive forces after the US abandoned industrialization. And this is a little ironic since I was kind of giving the Trump regime very limited credit earlier for trying to cleave the Russians off from China and the BRICS. Somehow they were able to see that trying to pull Russia towards us was a strong move for the empire. But they're so deluded about basically everything else that they will fail to compete with China on anything except for who's better friends with Russia. Our foreign policy, especially our economic foreign policy, cannibalizes the economies of our developing allies while China's develops them. That will only get less forgiving on us as China continues to cement itself as the world's industrial center, and as the US tries to rebuild its domestic industry, which will certainly result in a bunch of overpriced, low-quality goods sold to us by monopolies that have no chance of exporting anything. That's all we have time for on this episode of The Hastening. We kept things kind of broad on this one, looking at the bigger picture of imperialism within US politics. So next time we'll take things to the next level and see how crypto-imperialism looks up close, by analyzing the current war in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A Rwandan-backed rebel group called M23 has been on a rampage, sacking major cities and sending millions of people fleeing into exile. Tensions over this are spreading across the continent and threaten to unleash a Pan-African war, with leaders as far away as South Africa issuing threats against the Rwandan president Paul Kagame. So next time on The Hastening, we'll look at how the US and other imperial powers like France are the drivers of this conflict, even though they pretend to know little and less about it. We'll see y'all next time.
This has been a presentation of New LJ Television. Visit us online at newlj.tv.